Welcome to the second webinar in our volunteer management webinar series, The 7 Deadly Sins of Volunteer Management. My name is Sydney Shutro, and I'm the Director of Volunteer Services here at the Tennessee Commission on Aging and Disability. We had some more technical issues, and the video didn't record from the live webinar we had on Friday, February 21st. So I am doing a re-recording. But I do want to always start the webinars with a disclaimer that I am not a volunteer expert yet, but it is what I love to do, and many of the suggestions that I'm going to make throughout this webinar series I've implemented or I will be implementing alongside you all to make our volunteer programs across the state better. Also, everything that we discuss on any of the webinars is just a suggestion or a best practice. I'm not requiring anyone to make any of these changes in their program, and I do strongly encourage you, if you want to implement something that we talk about, to work with your supervisor, your coworkers, and your volunteers to make that happen. So last month I mentioned we were going to start to do a recruitment tip of the month section, because that was the highest requested topic, was just recruitment tips. When I initially asked everyone for their input about these webinar series last year. So even though we're going to talk a little bit about recruitment today, I still wanted to include this segment in the webinar. So for this month, our recruitment tip of the month is going to be specifically for the baby boomer generation. So these are individuals who were born between 1944 and 1964, ages around 55 to 75, and there's a pool of 76 million baby boomers across the country, not just in Tennessee, but across the country. And it's a population that a lot of people are looking to target because they're soon to be retired or already retired, and hopefully they're wanting to give back to their community, maybe have a little bit more free time than when they were working. So one of the unique recruitment tips that I found through my research was to contact local HR, human resource departments, to put your volunteer opportunity information in their employee retirement packages. So one topic that came up multiple times in the suggestions was how to recruit volunteers in rural communities. And I think this would be a unique way, especially for our rural counties and areas, to see if they could recruit some baby boomers by partnering with those local human resource departments and maybe your local agencies and industries in your community. So the inspiration for this webinar came from the book, The New Breed, Understanding and Equipping the 21st Century Volunteer. I'm not a big reader. In fact, it's probably one of my least favorite hobbies is reading. I'd rather listen to a book than read a book. But I could not put this book down. The authors are Jonathan and Thomas McKee. They're a father and son duo, and they give really great examples, share extremely relevant stories to the topics they address, and just kept my attention throughout. So they introduced the idea of the 7 deadly sins of volunteer recruitment, and it only uses about 24 pages of their book, so you can tell that there's just so much more information that they're willing to share in their publication, that I'm sure I'm going to be referencing this book so many times throughout our year here doing the webinar series. So if you couldn't tell, I highly recommend this book to you all if you're able to get it in your possession. It's got some really, really great tips and tricks for us. So everything we talk about is going to be inspired by Jonathan and Thomas McKee today. Before we dive into these sins, while the title is really catchy, it's also somewhat negative. So the first thing I can promise you is that we all do all, if not most, of these sins. So I'm as guilty as anyone in committing quite a few of these. Second, throughout the presentation, I hope to turn each sin into a redemption. And I have to give credit to my coworker, Kenetra Golden, for helping me come up with the word redemption. So with the tips and tricks on how to avoid and correct these sins, hopefully you'll be able to redeem yourself and turn a negative into a positive. And lastly, throughout the presentation, hopefully we'll get some new ideas for recruitment and maybe some updates to your current efforts and get some really good takeaways from this presentation. So without further ado, sin number 1 is expect announcements to get volunteers. Now, right off the bat, I can tell you I do this regularly. In fact, many of you who are listening right now may have received 1 or 2 of my announcements for some trainings for the programs I've been a part of. But I really want to focus on the key word in this sin is to expect. So the first thing we're going to do to try and redeem this sin is actually, to make it a positive spin, this sin is actually a great way to market your program. And there's always, when you're doing an announcement for a training or that you have a volunteer opportunity coming up, there's always a positivity in the message about the impact your program has or how you're accomplishing your mission. So the authors and myself, I really want to stress to you all that this sin doesn't mean to never make another announcement about your volunteer program or about an upcoming training. Continue to do that. Those announcements are extremely important. But the emphasis, again, on this sin is not to expect volunteers to come from those announcements. One of the things that we need to do is try and change our mindset on the word volunteer to help turn around this sin. So most people you'll come across don't want to volunteer. They want to be asked, and I'm going to actually get to that here in a second as well. But what the difference is, or what is the difference, and I do this myself, is to use, we typically tend to use volunteer as a verb. We need you to volunteer. Instead, we need to look at volunteer as a noun. So asking someone to commit as a volunteer to your mission, program, or cause. So now commit is the verb and volunteer is the noun. I'm terrible with grammar, so this one is probably going to take me a little while. But instead of saying, hey, we need, come volunteer for us, see volunteering being the noun, we need you to commit to visiting a nursing home, visiting the residents of a nursing home, or teaching a class at the senior center, delivering a meal, calling some people for telephone reassurance, attending a health fair to promote our organization, giving them something to do and trying almost to eliminate the word volunteer in a way. That sounds really crazy, I know. But going back to the ask, the best thing we can do is ask someone to be a volunteer. Make the ask. People want to, and this can definitely be done face-to-face. It can be done over the phone. Email is a little more informal and may not yield as many volunteers, but having that personal ask is very important. This is a direct quote from the book. Quote, most people don't want to volunteer, end quote. They want to be asked to help with a project. So again, not asking them to volunteer being the verb and not giving anything specific. If you just say volunteer, it kind of opens it up to anything that they could do, where if you ask them for a specific need that you have or a specific project they might be able to be involved in, you may yield more volunteers and have that volunteer stick around for a little while longer as well. So, sin number 2. Go it alone. Having that mindset of, don't worry, I got this, I don't need any help, I'll figure it out. And this is the one that I personally have to work on the most. I'm terrible at delegating and asking for help. And after reading this book and talking with a lot of my fellow colleagues, I realized if I asked for help, I bet my recruitment in all programs that I work with would increase dramatically. So how am I going to turn my personal sin into a redemption? The first thing that's suggested is to create a support group for volunteer management, or excuse me, volunteer recruitment. These are the people that you have a passion for, that have a passion for your program, is actively volunteering. I really want to stress the word actively. If you have someone who, yeah, loves the program, but they haven't really volunteered in a while, they may not be the #1 member of your support group. Eventually, they could be a member, but right off the bat, they may be considered at a later date and not presently. They know how to communicate about the program, and they have a vision for the future. So if they don't have the last two bullets, I still think they can be a member, and this is my personal feelings, I still think they can be a member of your support group because you can help them with talking points about the program to have them have clear communication. And you can also share your future that you see for the volunteer program to see if they have a similar vision for the future as well, so they're able to communicate that. So for those of you listening, what I'd like you to do for me, and this is what I had the participants do on the live webinar, is write down 3 to 5 current volunteers that you have in your program that you think meet at least the first 2 of these bullet points you see on the screen. And while you're writing those down, I'm going to give you a great example, a true example from our nutrition program that we have here in the state. So our nutrition director, Lacey Aviles, was accepted into the Tennessee Government Executive Institute at the end of 2018, where she was able to network with other state agencies. So the Tennessee Government Executive Institute, or TGEI for short, is like a leadership 2-week program that you're able to network, learn more about working internally with your staff, working with community partners, and things of that nature. So through the network she built, just with that first table that you're at that first day, she asked a few of her colleagues if they'd be interested in volunteering for the Meals on Wheels program. The commitment would only be to do 1 route per quarter, for the people to do 1 route per quarter if they were able to get enough volunteers. So she explained the importance of the program, the mission, and soon the people that she had at that first table helped her spread the message about this potential really kind of corporate volunteer program idea to the larger class. By the end of the 2-week program, she had 50 people who committed to doing at least 1 meal route a quarter, and for the last year, she and her TGEI group have delivered meals in Ashland City every single Friday for a little bit over a year, and there's no indication that they're going to stop their route. So it doesn't mean that they have to do the route every Friday, but if you have 50 people and there are 12 routes in a quarter, you'll easily be able to get those meals delivered with those 50 volunteers. So in the book, the McKees told a story about having a brainstorming session where they looked to recruit, or they asked the people who should we recruit volunteers from. Everyone wrote down answers and they discussed all of them. There's quite a bit of a debate as to what would work and what wouldn't. So the McKees, they got their big list on the dry erase board or the marker board, asked what the common denominator of all these different ideas were. And the common denominator for each of the idea was someone like Lacey who suggested it. So of course, if Lacey suggested the TGEI group just in one of our brainstorming sessions, I'd be like, I really don't know how to get in with that group, and I would have a different suggestion. So having Lacey go to her contacts, me going to my contacts, you can yield so much connection across your community and across other agencies that your network and your recruitment efforts, your volunteers are going to see a dramatic increase in recruitment, and then it'll be your primary responsibility to help retain them, make sure they have a good experience and they continue to volunteer with the program. It's also vitally important before you send out your volunteer recruitment support group that you know the volunteer roles that you need to fill. So you got to do some research. You got to do some inventory of your program. Do you need 50 people or do you just need 5? The worst thing you can do, one of the the worst practices instead of best practices, is you don't want to have too many volunteers and then they get bored and they don't return. You always want to have something for everyone who's volunteering to do and not just kind of sitting around. Do you have people in a specific county that you need, or at a specific location or specific day, specific time of the week? Anything like that is going to help your support group find that good individual to fit those slots that you need. So your volunteer role descriptions, and I'm going to talk about that probably every single webinar. I think it's extremely important to have those volunteer role descriptions. They're going to play a key role for those members to talk about the specifics of the program. Again, that transparency of when your support group goes out to recruit someone, they need to be able to communicate that message that, yes, if you want to volunteer, this is what we expect, and this is the time commitment that we're going to ask of you. And that will yield retention as well. So sin number 3 is recruiting only volunteers who want to make long-term commitments. Now, this one's going to be tough for a lot of our programs. That's my personal opinion on it. We spend a considerable amount of time doing screening for volunteers and also the training component of our programs. And it's hard not to want to recruit those long-term volunteers because we have those big time commitments that it takes for the screening and training components of our programs. So, when a volunteer is looking to commit to something, they really actually want that short term over the long term. And I think that many of us feel that same way. I know when I look for volunteer opportunities, I want to get a feel for the organization, so I do want to do something a little short term, and then as I go through and I see if I like the people that I'm working with, I like the organization and what they're doing in the community, then I can transition into that long term. So, short-term opportunities can open a lot of doors to the volunteer staying with the program longer. So remember back to sin number 1, volunteers want to be asked. So if they do a good job during the first short-term commitment, ask them to do another one. We discussed last webinar, there are some recruitment ideas like internships or the Tennessee Achieve students where they're required to do a certain number of hours of work. Even if you look at, fraternities and sororities or other civic groups, they have certain hours that they need to accomplish. This is considered a short-term commitment. But if you have, say, 10 students who need 50 hours of an internship or volunteer credits for community service, that adds up to a whole lot of hours that can make a huge impact on your program. Now, many of us know that a lot of students come to us for a shorter time frame than that 500 hours. They may say, I need 10 or I need 40 or something along those lines, to where you may have to find special, unique projects for them to do because maybe your training component of your program takes 10 hours or something like that for them to accomplish. So that wouldn't make a lot of sense to put a lot of time and effort into training when that training is all that they're going to get and then their commitment's over and they may not follow through. So transitioning a short-term volunteer into a long-term volunteer really depends on you, the volunteer coordinator, and your leadership. So if the volunteer has a good experience on their first project, they're more likely to say yes to your next ask. Also, if you want someone to stay long-term, you may want to consider giving that person more responsibility or providing additional training or continuing education they would be interested in. So it really does hinge on you. I know that's a lot of pressure, and I don't want to put a lot of pressure on you guys. But if you have someone who just wants to get a feel for the program, maybe you partner them with someone who's been with the program for a while. Maybe do kind of a mentoring, shadowing relationship where they can work with a fellow volunteer, and then you are right there as the follow-up. Hey, did you have a good experience? What could we do better? And really kind of debrief with them after their volunteer experience. So I know one of the struggles with this sin I see for our programs is how are we going to take the volunteer roles we've established already and make them more short-term. Some of us have short-term volunteer roles. Many of us have longer term. So I'm going to use the example of the Tennessee SHIP SMP program because that's where I started my career 8 years ago with that program. So personally, when I started with SHIP, I thought all the volunteers had to attend the 18-hour initial training no matter what kind of role they wanted to do. Of course, that was my own misinterpretation of what was supposed to be done. So as we looked at the roles of our volunteers, we started to see that someone who really just wanted to do data entry or admin work really didn't need to know the inner workings of Medicare, and they didn't need that whole 18 hours. Likewise, someone who only wanted to attend a health fair or a community event or even just pass out flyers really didn't need to know Medicare in depth, but they did need to at least know the basics. So in case they were asked questions or something along those lines. After the program was analyzed and we came together with the coordinators, we developed, instead of one volunteer role description, we had 5 volunteer role descriptions that had various levels of trainings, various levels of roles and responsibilities, and skills that were needed to accomplish the job that we're asking the volunteer to do. The program numbers jumped from around the low to mid 200s to over 400 in the span of a year and a half. And it's very important to note that we did not eliminate that long-term commitment. That was still an option. You could still do that long-term, but instead we added levels of shorter-term commitments that had less time dedicated to training, and ultimately it could lead to a volunteer starting in that short-term commitment and gradually moving those steps up to becoming that long-term volunteer. So sin number 4 is assuming that no means never. Instead, most of the time, or sometimes, I shouldn't say most of the time, sometimes a no simply means just not right now. So I highly encourage you not to cross those individuals off of your list if they just say, no, I don't want to volunteer right now. Or just simply, no, I don't want to volunteer. So there are so many countless reasons why someone may not want to volunteer for your program when you make the ask. Don't take it personally, unless they have the face of the baby that was in the previous slides, and that's pretty harsh. But instead, do your best to listen to their reasons and glean some information from it. So ask them if you could, what's going on? They might say they have too much on their plate right now, and I can't volunteer. So what's happening? What's all on your plate, if you don't mind me asking? So for example, if someone says something, and this is an example that I've received from a volunteer, I'm in my last year of grad school, and I already have volunteer commitments for 2 other agencies, and I just can't right now. So I asked her to kind of elaborate on that a little bit. And what I was able to glean from that conversation was I need to follow up with her in about 12 to 18 months. She'll be graduated from grad school. With some follow-up questions, I learned that those 2 agencies that she's currently volunteering for is a requirement of her grad school commitment. So hopefully she'll continue to volunteer with those 2 organizations, and they were able to retain her. But in the chance that maybe she doesn't want to continue to volunteer with that organization, I can come back and ask her if she'd be willing to volunteer for ours. So it's extremely important to keep in touch with people who've said no. So ask them if it's okay if you add them to your email list for your agency newsletter, or if they could, or you could send them information on upcoming trainings or orientations. Since maybe they're not available right now, but training's coming up in another 3 months, maybe they'll have some free time then. So just keeping that communication, keeping their email address, again, don't check them off your list. And the last thing is you might want to suggest an alternative to them to see if they still want to be involved with your agency. So they may not want to visit someone in a nursing home, but maybe they are willing to drive someone to the doctor's appointment or deliver a meal. We'd love for everyone to volunteer for our specific program, but overall, for all of our agencies, I'm sure, is to help make the lives of older adults better. So losing a volunteer potentially to one of the other programs in your agency, really not all that bad. So kind of keeping it in the family, so to speak, to see if maybe they'd be interested in volunteering for a different program. If none of those things work, then that person just may not be a fit to volunteer for our agency's programs, and then we can go ahead and cross them off the list. But we'd want to have a few steps in place before we just write somebody off. Sin number 5 is one I think we're all guilty of for a number of reasons. but recruiting any old BIC or button chair. Personally, I know I've made this sin because I have specific goals to meet, or just I was so happy that someone wants to volunteer. All right, come on, I'm going to train you, and then I'm going to figure out where you go. But what I found out is, yeah, it's great, I have a volunteer, but they really didn't fit what I needed them to do. So, again, I'm going to go back to the volunteer role descriptions, and I know I sound like a broken record, but in my opinion, your volunteer role description or job description or whatever you want to call it, again, it can be called many, many things, that is going to be the most important volunteer document that you have. So the roles and responsibilities and the knowledge, abilities, and skills that you need are going to guide you in finding the right person for the role you need filled. Some programs require a volunteer to sign their volunteer role descriptions or even a volunteer handbook of some sort that tells the volunteer coordinator they read and understood these things. So I think that's a really unique and clever way to have kind of a documentation that, all right, I think you're going to fit well in this role, and you've signed it and said that you've read these roles and responsibilities and know what to expect. Now, there's some people who might just sign and say, okay, good, I can do this, and maybe not read the document. But even if they lie and say, lie is probably too strong of a word, but if they sign it without reading it, at least you have the documentation that says the person said they read it, whether they did or didn't, and knows what you expect of them in the role. And if they don't meet those expectations, you're able to revisit that description and kind of highlight, based on that document, what things they may be doing, or they may need to be doing a little bit better. So it could be done in a formal review process, or maybe a little bit of some informal things. You don't need to have the piece of paper in front of you to say, hey, we really need you to work on this, this, and this per the volunteer role description that you signed when you first started. Having these roles and responsibilities and knowledge, skills, and abilities in place are going to help increase your retention as well. So I've heard many times from volunteers, I had no idea volunteering was going to involve this, or I was going to have to do all of this, and I never realized it was going to be such a time commitment. Guess where that volunteer is today? They're not volunteering with the program anymore. So again, that transparency is so key in continuing to retain those volunteers and having them know what is expected of them. Now, not to knock board members, but unfortunately, this sin of the butts in the chairs, any old butt in the chair, BIC, is done most often when recruiting board members, and I've done this as well. So many of us do not work directly with board members, but many of our senior centers, for example, do. We may have advisory councils or commission members or things like that that we do have to work with. When someone rolls off of the board, you want to replace that person probably as quickly as possible. You know, you want to have the most people on your board to help govern your agency as possible. But before you replace that person, you really need to do a review of your current board and see what gaps you need to be filled. Or do you need someone maybe with fundraising experience or program management? Do you have a board member role description? That's going to be a key. Remember, most board members, well, in my opinion, all board members are considered volunteers unless you pay them, which then they're kind of an employee. But if it's a volunteer role to be a board member, make sure you have a volunteer role description for that board member. And you may have different volunteer role descriptions for different board members. You may have, we need a board member with fundraising experience, volunteer experience, program management, event planning, something along those lines. So having multiple role descriptions for board members could be key in really getting a diverse, experiential, I don't know if that's a word, group of people on your board to really impact and make your agency thrive. I've been the chair of a nominating committee on a board to recruit other members, and it's not easy at all. So hopefully we'll be able to narrow our focus and not just try and recruit someone to just fill a slot in terms of the board members. Sin number 6 is treating professionals like lackeys. So have you ever felt guilty about asking busy people to volunteer? If you cut out the word busy, isn't it just like asking any other person to be a volunteer? So professional volunteers are extremely important for a lot of our programs. And it's not our job to know if or assume someone is too busy to volunteer. A busy person is going to let you know, no, I'm just not able to right now. I got a lot on my plate, you know, going back to one of the previous sins, really gleaning from that conversation why they're not able to volunteer right now. So still make that ask. If you never ask, then of course the answer is going to be no. But if you do ask, you might get a yes. So, excuse me, professionals want to do something that is significant to the agency that they're volunteering for. Busy work, like stuffing envelopes, entering data, filing papers, stuff like that, probably not going to make them stick around too long. Now, professionals do understand if you ask them to have a higher responsibility role, and maybe it requires some reporting or some paperwork that needs to be filled out, that's different than doing busy work. Busy work is, here's a stack of papers, I need you to file them. Instead, getting them to be the leader of a project may include having all that paperwork that they have to organize, but they're doing it for the bigger purpose of the project. So they're a professional in a field. Use the skills and expertise that they already know. If, for example, if you have a retired nurse, and I'm using this as an example because I know many of our senior centers do this, use their skills to maybe set up a weekly or a monthly health check. Maybe they do blood pressure screenings or something non-super invasive. Or maybe someone who's retired from the nonprofit industry. Maybe they have experience with fundraising or volunteer management. I can almost guarantee anyone coming from the nonprofit field has at least some experience with fundraising, or else their nonprofit may not flourish as well. See if they'd be willing to be a member of a fundraising committee for maybe a senior center or a special project that you have at your agency. And who knows, if they have a good experience, maybe in a couple of years they'll become the chair of that fundraising committee. And that's going to take a lot of pressure off of you, is knowing that you have someone to fill that slot who has the expertise and the experience and the skills to be able to run that committee and really get a good fundraiser. Find out what they love to do, and and kind of set them free. Let them do it. If you don't have an idea of something that they could do right away, ask them to come and visit your site and see if they have a suggestion for anything that they can use their skills and expertise to help improve the organization. So they may be able to do an organizational analysis or a project analysis on certain things that you're struggling with, and see if they can lend their expertise or their skills to help fill that gap. And the last sin number 7, is hiring professionals who know nothing about volunteer management. Now, this one is more geared toward people with hiring power, which may not be many of us. And this is a common trend in volunteer management. There really is not a lot of formal training in the field, so it's very common for someone who's now over volunteer management to not have all that much experience in the field. Sure, there may be a couple college classes, a certificate program here or there, but to my knowledge, there's no degree in volunteer management. Unless you know of one, please let me know because I would love to get it. On last month's webinar, I polled the attendees and asked how many years of experience everyone had in volunteer management. 40% of people said they had less than 1 year of experience. 73% of us have less than 50% of our overall job dedicated to volunteer management. So you can see this sin is more of a trend. And we are, like many countless other agencies and programs across the world, not even the country, but across the world, fall into this sin and into this trend. So you're not alone, and don't It's not a bad thing. We're all going to learn as we go through our experiences. So when hiring someone at your agency, work with any program that needs volunteers. Volunteers really need to be mentioned in every single job description of every program. Many of the programs have their volunteer, just their regular program coordinator is also their volunteer coordinator. So not only do they have to run the program, they have to gather partnerships and do all the paperwork and collect all the data and do all the reports, but they're also lumped into all of that other responsibility. They're also the volunteer coordinator. And I know many of us, especially if a grant or grant funding is tied to our coordinator position, volunteer coordinating may be put on the back burner. Not intentionally, not vindictively, it's just kind of how the priorities fall. You know, data helps. If you have more numbers, you may potentially be able to get more funding. So that may be a higher priority. But did you know, if you're a coordinator, that's also part of your job is to be a volunteer coordinator. Did you know that before you accepted the position? Did you know you were going to have to work with volunteers? Is it in your current job description that you are to oversee and work with volunteers? If not, I highly, highly recommend you work with your supervisor and get it added as soon as possible. I'm not saying you should quit. Please don't quit. I will be in so much trouble if you quit. I don't want anyone to quit. But this suggestion is more a way to look at succession planning and make sure that the person that comes in after you has the best experience and kind of knows what the expectation of your job is. So if today you went home and you bought the lottery ticket and you won the Mega Millions and you got to retire and never work again, the person who fills your position, do they know that they're going to be working with volunteers? And I hope that the answer is yes. If the answer is not yes, please work with your supervisor to help make sure that that is an expectation that is set. During the interview portion of hiring someone to work with volunteers, make sure you ask multiple questions about volunteers, their experience. Are they a volunteer? My mentality, personal mentality, this is not in any book, this is just my personal philosophy. The best volunteer coordinators are good volunteers. So get out there. You learn a lot from doing volunteer work, and you learn a lot from other volunteer coordinators, how they manage and run their programs to help you make your program better as well. Their experience of how they handled a volunteer that didn't meet a commitment, their best volunteer experience, maybe their worst volunteer experience and how they handled it. So many questions that you could gauge the attitude of the applicant to see if they have a positive or negative feeling toward volunteers. If you have someone that says, you know, nah, we don't need volunteers, we'll just get interns to do everything and it'll be fine, probably not the best fit for the program that is volunteer-based. So gauging that enthusiasm toward volunteers is going to be important. And let them tell you stories, or maybe it's just me because I really love stories. But through a story, you're going to be able, especially if they're excited about the story, you're going to see their passion for volunteer management really shine. Organizations can also provide or allow opportunities for continuing education. Listening to this webinar or attending it live is a prime example of that. You may be able to ask for permission to attend other workshops or conferences on volunteer management. So if you don't have that experience coming into the position, it's okay. There are so many opportunities for you to learn more and be able to really fit that role and really become passionate about what you're doing and not feel like you're just kind of thrown into something and turn that negative again into a positive. So a couple things that we have here in the States and nationally to help with that continuing education and consistent learning is Volunteer Tennessee. They just finished their annual conference, so I'll be sure as I get the dates for their 2021 conference. It's usually in Franklin, Tennessee, here in Middle Tennessee. I'll be sure to get you all that information if anyone wants to attend that conference. It's really great, or even submit a proposal to speak at the conference. I think would be great to get our programs highlighted there at the state level. There is also the Points of Light organization, has the biggest volunteer conference in the world, and it's coming up on June 10th to 12th in Washington, D.C. Now, it is an expensive training conference to attend, so you would have to get, I'm sure, special permission. I really, really wish I could go, but I have a conflict and I have to go to another conference. So if anyone is able to attend that one, I would love to connect with you when you get back, see some things that you learned. Maybe you just attended a really great session about a topic, and maybe we can see if we can get them on as a guest speaker for our webinars and share their insights with the group. I would love to do that. Also, another thing to consider possibly is the Council for Certification in Volunteer Administration has a Certified Volunteer Administrator certificate available. Certification, not certificate, excuse me, certification. I'm going to be taking the exam in April, so hopefully get my CVA, Certified Volunteer Administrator certification. So I'll send information about the upcoming conferences and the CVA certification to see if anyone is interested. So all of these things, again, cost money. So please make sure you speak with your supervisor, see if it's something that's in your budget and that you're able to do, or if it's not in the budget this year. Last month, we talked about creating that volunteer recruitment budget. You might want to put a specific line item in there for continuing education for yourself and add attending a conference or two or getting the certification as part of your budget. And if any of you know of any additional educational opportunities that are coming to your area, please pass them along to me and I'll be sure to pass them to the group. So that way, even me, I love to go to these trainings when I'm able to. Hopefully I'll be able to meet many of you who I don't know just via email. I'll be able to attend a training with you and we'll be able to connect that way as well. And that's it. So those are our 7 deadly sins. Now on the live webinar, I asked the participants to do a poll for me. So I asked about their thoughts of these 7 deadly sins. And I'd love to get your thoughts as well. So please feel free to shoot me an email and let me know what you think. But the first question I asked was how many quote unquote sins have the people on the webinar committed? Now I can tell you personally, I have committed 5 of the 7. I don't have any hiring power, so it wasn't number 7 for me. And I don't treat professionals like lackeys. I think I'm good at making sure that if it's a professional volunteer, they're really utilizing their skills. But the other 5, I do those all the time. So I was able to, with technical issues, I was able to get the results of this poll and, or no, excuse me, this was not the one I was able to get. But if memory serves me correctly, a majority of people on the call said they committed 3 or more sins. I don't think anyone said 0, 1, or 2. So everyone was 3 or above. I apologize, I don't have any more specific data on that. If memory serves me right, I think most people said they committed 4. But still, now that we have those redemptions and those suggestions for how to change that sin into a positive or that negative into a positive, I don't think we'll be committing many more of those sins by the end of this year. The other question that I asked the group was, which sin are you going to work for redemption the most? And I do have the results of that poll. I don't have it on the screen, but I'm going to tell you about it. So personally, mine was sin number 2, the go it alone. Like I said, I'm kind of a control freak, self-diagnosed control freak, and I don't like to ask other people for help. And I don't want to say I was excited to know that people are just like me, but 35% of people on the call that responded said that they were just like me, and number 2 was the sin that they were going to seek redemption for. We also had 8% say sin number 1, number 4, and number 6. No one said sin number 7, so that was kind of expected. I'm not sure if many of us have that hiring power in the agency. And then a couple people mentioned number 3 and number 5. So we have a wide range of people who are going to be working on different SINs. So as you are looking for redemption, if you need any help or support, please let me know or let your fellow coworkers, volunteers, and colleagues know, and I'm sure you'll be able to kind of reverse that SIN into a redemption very, very quickly. So before I let everybody go and wrap up the call, I did want to give everybody a few reminders of some things that are coming up. So first thing, I want to remind everyone about the 2020 volunteer campaign that we're doing. We talked about that at the end of January's webinar. But please be sure to submit your Make a Difference Monday participant forms. This is the social media campaign that we're going to be doing to highlight volunteers for our programs every Monday for the year. So we just kind of ask them to fill out some information about their name, the program they volunteer for, where they volunteer, and kind of give their testimonial. So I want to thank My Ride, Tennessee Ship SMP, and Meals on Wheels. Those are the 3 programs that we've had submissions for so far. And actually, since I did the webinar on Friday, we've had 2 more submissions come in. So we have Make a Difference Monday covered through April 13th, but that's still many, many more months and many, many more Fridays to come in the year. So please be sure to ask your volunteers to fill out the Make a Difference Monday form so we can get them highlighted and recognized. Also, I wanted to remind you all to send in any data for volunteers that you have in January. We're just looking at January 2020 specifically right now. I know many of our programs are still collecting data. Usually what happens is you ask volunteers to report their activity for January by the end of February. It's not the end of February yet, so I'm hoping around the first week or 2 of March I'll have more people reporting their data for January. But I'm excited to let you all know that we have 730 volunteers that have been reported with over 4,000 hours of volunteer activity in just January alone. So if you look at how much money a volunteer hour is on the national scale, it's $25.43 an hour is the value of a volunteer hour nationally. So we're looking at over $101,000, almost $102,000 worth of in-kind contributions for our programs, which is just phenomenal. I'm super duper excited. Also, I do want to remind everyone that the programs that submit data to us are going to be invited to those volunteer recognition luncheons that we're going to have once we meet our 2020 volunteers for 2020 goal. And already in 1 month, if we have 730 volunteers in just a few programs that have reported data, I have no doubt in my mind that we're going to meet that 2020 volunteer goal. And hopefully here within the next month or 2, once I have that solid data reported, I can't just assume and guess and estimate. I have to actually have the data to support we have all of these individuals volunteering for us. I'm hoping here within the next month or 2, maybe even 3, we'll be able to start the planning process for those volunteer recognition luncheons. And hopefully my goal would be to have those luncheons completed by the fall so that our Tennessee SHIP SMP volunteers would be able to participate as well, because I know that's a really busy time for them. So keep the data coming. Just shoot me an email. Remember, all I need is the number of volunteers that you have and the volunteer hours that they had that month. Don't need to know the names or anything like that. Just need the numbers. And thank you again to all of you who've already reported numbers and to those of you who will be reporting numbers. I also wanted to remind everyone our next webinar is going to be Friday, March 20th at 10 o'clock a.m. Central Time or 11 o'clock Eastern Time. And we're going to be discussing volunteer orientations, kind of looking at the orientation as the 10,000-foot view of your program. And with that, I want to thank you all so much for listening in on the webinar. I look forward to talking with you next month. And if you have any questions at all, feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call, and I'm happy to work with you on any question, concern, or best practice that you have and you'd like to share.